Video 2 of observational learning is going to look specifically at variables that affect learning. We'll look at characteristics of a model and an observer to talk about how those interplay to produce learning. And then we're going to look at a couple of theories of why observational learning works, as well as a couple of applications. So to start, what variables make observational learning more or less effective? The first thing is the characteristics of the person we're looking to as a model. Who do we choose as our model when we're looking to learn a behavior? We know that we tend to gravitate towards more attractive models in terms of physical features. We tend to model people we like more than people we don't like. We tend to look towards more prestigious individuals because they have authority in a given situation. And we choose to model people who are similar to ourselves in terms of things like age, sex, interests, career, education level, state of origin, etc., etc. So attractive, likable, and prestigious people and/or people who are more similar to us are the ones that we choose to model behaviors after. Interestingly enough, this works when it comes to fictional characters as well. We don't just model real people, but can actually learn behaviors from our favorite fictional characters. I've done research in the past that looks at whether or not we learn what to expect from romantic partners based off of the romantic partners we see in TV shows. And there's actually evidence to suggest that how we behave in our own romantic relationships is to some extent modeled after the romantic relationships we choose to watch on TV or in books. So modeling is not necessarily something that just happens in the real world, but can extend to the types of fiction, the types of media we're consuming as well. Now we want to look at characteristics of the observer. When do we choose to model someone? If I'm watching someone who I like, someone who's attractive and prestigious, someone who's like me, when do I choose to actually mimic or imitate their behaviors? We know that language development actually plays a big role in our ability to model behavior. Modeled behavior goes into language development, meaning modeling actually helps us learn how to speak, how to form words, what words go together, how to produce sentences, how to hold a conversation, the back and forth give and take of a conversational style, and so on and so forth. Age also plays an important role here. Research suggests that children might observe and model behaviors more than adults. That makes sense. They're less sure of their surroundings, they have less experience, they have to look to others more. But adults may actually use more of what they observe. So children spend more time looking, taking it in, but adults might actually be better or more likely to engage in behaviors that were modeled for them. Maybe we've learned how effective that can be. Maybe we're more concerned with maintaining that cognitive capacity. We have better attention and memory skills as an adult also, which probably plays a role. That brings me to our first theory of observational learning, and this is something called social cognitive theory. If you've taken a general psychology class, you're likely familiar with the Bobo doll experiment. You might have also learned this in a social psychology class. This was the first study that looked at, do we learn violent or aggressive behaviors from the media? If you're familiar with work on violent video games and things like that, this is where it came from. And it was started by a man named Albert Bandura, who was first interested in whether or not kids learn behaviors from adult models, basically specifically looking at aggressive behaviors. So take a second when you have a chance, look at the Bobo doll experiment. What you'll see is that kids can learn how to play with a toy more or less aggressively based off of what a model is doing with that toy. And this experiment, it was an early experiment, taught us a lot about social cognitive theory specifically. So, what we know, learned behavior that's based off of a model has a couple of components that are necessary, okay? Learning is not just copying the behavior of a model. Rather, it has 4 components that are required in order for us to actually say that a behavior was learned through observation. The first one is attention, then we have retention, reproduction of the behavior, and then motivation. So the attentional process, according to social cognitive theory, in order to learn, we must first notice a behavior. So this actually teaches us a lot about how observational learning works. What do we pay attention to? When do we pay attention to it? That's an important component of what we end up learning through observation. For example, we tend to pay attention to curse words when we hear them. If somebody yells fire, we pay attention to that. We pay attention when we're stressed out, when we're unsure. So anything that motivates or demotivates attention is going to be important here. The state of the observer, how quickly or effectively the model grabs our attention, and the context in which the behavior is occurring can all impact whether or not we pay attention to a behavior. Then we have retentional processes. Do we actually remember the behavior that we witnessed? We know that most learned behaviors don't happen until later. We don't immediately start modeling or imitating behaviors after we've learned them. So this type of learning actually requires memory. One way our brains help us out with the ability to retain or remember modeled behaviors is through symbolic representation in memory, meaning that it helps we remember more when we're able to verbally encode what we've learned. For example, I might watch someone put a computer together. While I was watching this process, I was saying things to myself, labeling behaviors, and that allowed me to encode it better. Not that I could ever in a million years put a computer together, but you get my example. This is one reason that language development is so tied into observational learning. Once we have the ability to use language in a way that helps us retain information, we're better at reproducing those behaviors later on. And then we have motor reproduction. Not only do we have to pay attention and remember a behavior, we also have to physically be able to do it ourselves. So motor reproduction involves physical ability and mental ability. Can I do the behavior? It also involves self-reflection and self-evaluation. So motor reproduction also involves the ability for us to maybe sit still and be patient. If you're familiar with the Marshmallow Experiment, whoa, I took that out of the slide. You'll remember, hopefully, that a study was done where children were given a marshmallow and asked to wait 5 minutes. If they successfully did not eat the marshmallow in 5 minutes, they would be given a new marshmallow. Then they'd have 2. That kind of regulation is an important motor ability and plays a role in how well we can reproduce behaviors like being patient and waiting. We also have to be able to evaluate our own behavior. Self-reflection and evaluation, as we think about the behavior, as we reflect on our own ability to do the behavior, we can actually fine-tune and tweak our own motor reproduction abilities to get better at it in the future. And then the last one is very important, motivation. If we're actually going to do a behavior, we have to be motivated to do it. Do we have a reason to perform the behavior? If not, social cognitive theory would say maybe learning hasn't necessarily occurred. And this actually relies heavily on operant conditioning. So Bandura, if you think back to the video you watched with the Bobo doll experiment, he believed that conditioning was important. Reward and punishment, that's where motivation comes from, okay? He thought it wasn't enough to explain behavior, so he developed social cognitive theory, which is what we're learning about right now. But he did think that this motivation component was heavily based on operant conditioning. Is that behavior going to be reinforced or punished in the environment? That's going to determine whether I'm motivated to do it. This type of reinforcement can come from 2 different places. External sources would be like Lincoln Riley yelling at you because you didn't run a play correctly. External sources can be very motivating, reinforcing of behaviors, but they're not the only ones. We can actually be motivated by internal sources as well, okay? The individual can have an intrinsic, internal desire to do the behavior, and that can cause this type of learning to occur as well. Next, we have the operant learning model, and this is our last theory of observational learning, and we've actually talked a little bit about this as well. But the operant learning model of observational learning is based again on that vicarious reinforcement and punishment that we talked about in video 1. The operant learning model says that we engage in observed behaviors, we imitate models because those behaviors are either vicariously punished or vicariously reinforced. It's as simple as that. That brings me to the end of chapter 10. Please let me know if you have any questions.